Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Constantine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about scope in research questions, or how to find a research question, or how to formulate a research question that is of an appropriate scope for the assignment that you have, the task that you have to do, and the means that you have to do them. There are many questions that one could pursue, but most of us are limited by some element of time and resources, with usually having other things that you want to do and are doing in parallel, and wanting to find something that is sufficient to the task, that is something that you will feel good about doing, and also that will contribute in some way, shape, or form to what's going on. Not just regurgitating, not asking something simple and basic, but approaching a question where the answer is helpful, of interest. That is something that you can say, you know what, I delved into that and we came to some conclusions, whatever those should be. So we're going to start by looking at some of the characteristics of a strong research question according to that. And I always ask people to look at these slides and see, can you pick out where the error is? Because just as with any assignment at work or a class where small details matter, if you scrutinize a slide, you'll be able to find something that is out of place. And if you're thinking, singular, questions, plural, those don't agree, you'd be right. So that should be characteristics of a strong research question or characteristic of strong research questions. Now, for consistency and parallel writing, if you pick singular in this one, stick with singular in the second learning objective. If you are using research questions plural here, then change number 2 to research questions plural as well to match. All right, let's go to our main point here. What are some of the characteristics of a strong research question? And we could look at this resource from the University of Minnesota. And they say, well, first of all, it should be something that is original and of interest to the research and the outside world. That is to say, something that is going to be not just what someone else has asked for the same context before. Which I will say, with the caveat that if something significant has changed, new evidence has come up that might alter the understanding, then it's appropriate to revisit, but then you're specifically following and trying to update that. And so that would be the new part that you're adding. Something that's clear and focused, that provides enough specifics that it's easy to understand why you're trying to answer this question, and sufficiently narrow that you can answer it. If the research question is, what is the meaning of life? You could speculate on that, but you're probably not coming to any answers in 8 to 10 pages. That's very broad. And there's so many things that would affect how you'll be trying to answer that, that as the caveat here goes, if the question is too broad, it may not be possible to answer it thoroughly. Now, if it's something narrow, what happens if I mix blue and yellow together? That's going to depend a lot on how we go into detail. Now, if it was, what if we mix this particular blue pigment and this yellow pigment? What do we get, and what's the process behind that? That's a very different question from just what would we get if we mixed those. So it might be something where your initial idea, if you expand it, that you will have a research question that is broad enough to really delve into. If you're joining us, we're just starting to delve into the characteristics of a strong research question, looking at this particular list from the University of Minnesota. So number 1, something that is original or adding to the scholarship, and about something that is of interest to you as the researcher and to the outside world. Something that is clear and focused, so not so broad that we can't reasonably answer this, not so narrow that we say, well, yeah, duh, we didn't need to write a paper for that. And with those, with whatever balance you find, we want to focus in on a question that is doable, that is answerable, that is researchable in terms of whatever time and resources you have. Now, if you were taking the capstone course for which we are drawing our example today, you have a couple weeks to delve into it. Some assignments you'll have a few days. If you're working on a doctoral dissertation, you might be working on that for months or years. So think about what time you potentially have, what time you ideally want to put into it, and what an appropriate investment of time and other resources are for that. Now, as an example, I have a book that I am working on right now, and I hire various research assistants to go and look in the archives for things for that. And there are lots of archives I would like to go to and look at, but also I would also like to get this book published sometime this decade. So while I might go look at those, it'd be helpful to do that for a follow-up journal article or a follow-up book. Now, continuing through here, we have an analytical rather than descriptive. So rarely do you want to craft a research question that is only asking what is going on. A, because that's more reporting or descriptive, and B, because what's going on is usually not the question of interest so much as what is going on and how, or what is going on and why, and what is going on and how do people feel about it, and things of that ilk. So as this continues, the research question should allow you to produce an analysis of an issue or problem rather than a simple description of it. And so that's something that, generally speaking, unless you are doing a study where one of the research questions is there a statistically significant relationship between X and Y, which that would be a yes or no. Unless you have a couple questions of that ilk, most of your questions should be something where a yes or no is really not an appropriate answer. And in studies where there is that sort of question about statistical associations, those are usually going to be your secondary or tertiary questions that you use to answer your primary or secondary research questions. So not the thing that the study as a whole is designed to answer, but just a means to an end. The next two bullets, the results are potentially important and may change current ideas and or practice. That is less the case with undergraduate papers, but very commonly the case with graduate work. And as an example, I have many classmates who were working on their degrees in music conducting when I was in graduate school. And their ideas, they were taking things that they learned in other classes and applying them to standard pieces of the repertoire and saying, oh, based on this, this is what this means, and therefore this is what I'm recommending be done. And many of these are now standard manuals that are being used by conductors preparing those pieces to say, oh, yes, rather than wondering about what this is, I can draw on this other person's scholarship that they put out here. But it started out with answering a question that required more than a yes or no, like, oh, understanding the original social context and the intents of the creators, how should this piece be conducted? And that could be something well-known like, say, Handel's Messiah or the Mozart Requiem, or it could be something that is less well-known, an entirely new piece, a piece by a composer who's been forgotten, and many other examples not involving music. This last one, I wouldn't worry about terribly much for an undergraduate paper, but in some graduate projects, it is very much of interest, the potential to develop further projects with similar themes. Because this is really asking the question, what to you as the researcher and writer, what interests you and why? And so if you are taking your interests and you're applying them to one project, you can also take them and apply them to another project of a different focus later. And so think about, what might you want the arc of your research to be? Now, with that, let's talk about how to formulate a research question of an appropriate scope. And for this, we are going to look at the assignment that we've chosen as our focus. So this is coming from BMSO 491, and this is Christian Ministry and Spiritual Formation, the capstone. This is the week 2 assignment to project update, where you're asked to work on something towards the final project. Let's take a look at the instructions for this. All right, you should now be seeing my screen where I've got the web browser open to the Canvas course, and we see, oh, it's pretty short. We don't have a rubric really, we just have use the research paper topic selection document on the major project page to help you formulate the focus of your research paper. And then, so we see this is intended as a step towards a larger end. Let's take a look at those things. And just backing up briefly, so just to contextualize it, we have the overall goal of critically and theologically reflecting on ministry context, educational journey, and spiritual formation. Great. So we are going to delve into this, and I apologize, I missaid the course code. This is BCMO 491, not BMSO. All right, so if we look at this, we have a general set of instructions here about the outline. We also have a model for structuring the paper. Now, often in our webinars, we'd be talking about how to construct this sort of outline here. Because it's been given to you, we're going to focus on the thesis and the questions that you'll be trying to answer here. Now, this is very much an open topic assignment as far as what you are choosing, but we have a lot of things that might go into choosing what that question that we're going to answer is. And so looking at this document here, you'll see that there's a number of instructions here, and that you're encouraged to follow this outline, but also to tweak it as needed, because you might have some other things that you feel important to discuss sooner rather than later. And so while the outline is a starting point, it's not necessarily an unchangeable document. Now, the question of research questions. So this is largely left out for us to determine, but I often get questions, what's the relationship between the thesis and the research question? And part of that is just a matter of terminology. So the thesis is the central idea that you are exploring in your paper. Generally speaking, the central idea that you are looking to convince your reader about. And so the research question or research questions are often formulated with the goal of being able to support that thesis. We're going to come back to that. We're going to look at this assignment, this course as a whole, and contextualize our thoughts just a little bit. So if we're looking at this, we see week 1, we're beginning with some resources that are delving into some deep questions. The book of Job is definitely one of the most thought-provoking and most discussion-worthy parts of the Bible. There's a long tradition in Jewish scholarship. There's a long tradition in Christian scholarship, and it's something that never fails to provoke a lot of conversation in Bible studies, because one of the things that comes up in it is this question of, why do bad things happen to good people? And that in itself, if you set that as your research question, I would say, well, that's going to be at least a book, but you can scale it down. Let's say you were taking the book of Job as your focus here. Okay, we could scale it. Okay, in the book of Job, what is presented as an answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Then you would be basing it on the text, and you could introduce different analyses and discussions of the text, parallels in other parts of the Bible. And that, so we're narrowing the scope from this question in general, which is admittedly rather hard to answer, to, oh, we're bounding the question by a specific part of the Bible. and that becomes much more manageable a scope. Let's go back to our prompts here coming from the University of Minnesota guide, where it says we should consider when crafting a research question, is it researchable in terms of time and access? Now, in terms of biblical scholarship, there's a lot. We've got literally thousands of years of biblical scholarship, of which a few hundred are relatively easy for us to access today. You could access quickly through ACU's online library. All right, so have access is one thing, have the time to read it all. Now, do you need to do an exhaustive study of everything that's done there? Well, if your question was something along the lines of, across 2,000 years of Christian history, what have commentators said about the book of Job and the question of why do bad things happen to good people? Well, that is giving you the task of either reading or filtering or reading other people who read and filtered 2,000 years of scholarship. That's a lot to work on. Now, if you were posing a question like, how do Generation Z writers respond to the book of Job? Okay, we just collapsed that to a much younger set of writers, a much smaller body of literature in comparison. And so things like that, we can make the question of a more manageable scope. Now, let's look at some questions here and recognizing where this course is and that what we're going to next look at is a higher standard than you're expecting to. Let's just look at some examples of published research from ACU and some of the research questions therein and what makes them manageable. So if you're not familiar with it otherwise, ACU maintains a digital commons where theses and dissertations are posted. And these are for various degrees, master's, bachelor's, doctoral. And so you will find a variety of different things up here. Now, just looking at this, let's say we were taking, let's see. Let's say we were taking this work by Brett Bradley. We're going to look first at the abstract, which is a summary of the doctoral dissertation. And we can look at this and see that there seems to be very much a geographic focus on Oklahoma. And they tell us what the research questions were. So what is the average principal turnover rate for principals in Oklahoma? So that's an interesting question. It's not a yes/no answer. It's a numerical one, but it's one that's very important to answer if the data isn't there already. And if we were to delve into this, we'd find that there's awareness that it was high, but not what the average turnover rate was in that state. So, and then to break that down, is there this significant difference at different levels? Has that changed because of the COVID pandemic? What can predict whether a principal will change or not? Now, if we're looking at this and we're looking at the question of manageable scope, all right, certainly of interest to the researcher in the outside world, there are a lot of students in Oklahoma, and those going to public schools with principals, they and their families and the teachers there are all very interested in principal turnover. So certainly of interest to the outside world as well. Now, clear and focused. Looking at those questions, and we have a set of questions, but it's very clearly bounded by the geography. They have set the scope as being Oklahoma. And in fact, if we look back here, we see they bound it as saying they want to explore principal turnover in Oklahoma in a specific period of time. And that's more or less a 15-year period. 13 years of data plus some overlap on the ends. Okay, that's enough to get a good set of information on that body of teachers. And actually looking at that, I'm astonished that there are 1,700 school principals in Oklahoma. That's actually much more than I would have expected. And so that, again, reinforces that this is something of interest. All right. Now, they have multiple questions, each of which has interesting and potentially high stakes answers. So even though the questions themselves are narrow, as a whole, they are broad enough to generate important insights. And you get that more with a quantitative study where some of your questions are going to be, okay, what are the numbers related to this? As opposed to a qualitative study where you might be asking questions more about what something means. Now, that analytical rather than descriptive, we'll talk about that a little bit as we look at the manuscript. The results are potentially important and may change current ideas in their practice. I think that's the idea. Looking at this abstract, it is very clear that they're looking at a nationwide problem and trying to figure out what is the scope of that problem in their local context and what can be done to potentially try and change that. Now, we have the results and say that here, oh, it's pretty consistent with the nationwide trend. All right, well, it's not a good nationwide trend. So the fact that it's pretty close means it's definitely a problem that needs to be worked on. They found some big differences at that level. Surprisingly, COVID didn't have anything to do with that. Why might that answer be important? Well, there are lots of things that COVID gets blamed for, and saying, well, the data shows that it was changing at the same rate as before, and that, oh, how much you pay them and how much experience they have doing this strongly inform whether people stay around. That's actually really interesting to know. And then because for some people, they think, well, maybe it's because their background didn't prepare them for the job. They found, no, it's salary and educational experience predict it, turnover, race and gender do not. And so if you had people who had some potential bias or frankly, some clear bias there, this is telling us, no, don't focus on this. These are the ones that the study shows are things you can affect to keep someone around longer, or help keep someone around longer. Now, if we look at the document itself, and anyone can access these online, if we look at the document itself, we find that they go into some of these details in much greater, but let's look at how they laid out their questions. So we have here RQ1, so that's research question 1. And so these look like these are more or less equally ranked questions. There's none that are labeled as secondary questions, none that are labeled as tertiary questions. But instead, we seem to be looking at the phenomenon through a set of different lenses. First, what's going on as far as the turnover? Second, as far as that turnover is concerned, are there any details when you look more deeply into it? That's that RQ2. Is there a significant difference in turnover rates between these different levels? RQ3 was that changed by COVID-19. And the last is looking at 4 factors to see if they are independently predictors of turnover. And so these are all things that are, to some level, at the discretion of a hiring committee. Salary, how much you offer to pay people. Race, who you recruit. Gender, same thing. Total educational experience, what kind of cutoffs you might have for making your short list of people to interview. And so looking at this, we have 4 questions all exploring this phenomenon. And they are each independently, just one of them would probably not be enough to get a good study done. But if you were doing something like this as an undergraduate paper, each of them could be something where it was a research question appropriate for a paper of 8 to 10 pages. Keep in mind that you'd probably start with one of these questions, like what are the turnover rates? and then to have the follow-up question or the application question, and what does this mean for a local context? Now and what does it mean in the local context in terms of this doctoral dissertation that's described in a particular area? And I'm just going to open this by itself just to scroll around a little easier. If we look at the table of contents, we will see that we have our research questions first introduced in chapter 1. But in chapter 4, we have a discussion of the data they got and the answers to those questions. Chapter 5 is about, and what does that mean? So thinking about, and what does that mean, and what kind of data you're going to be generating, that is really important for your having a question that will ultimately be generating helpful, useful, applicable answers. Now, let's just take a look at the material for week 2 here that corresponds with this class. So for week 2, we have death brought in. Well, okay, a lot of that is in Job. We've got a lot of other stuff more directly written for today's context, as well as some Psalms. Now, unless you have a prior detailed background in theology and religious studies, maybe you don't want to be writing your own analysis of one of those Psalms, but you could be certainly drawing on other people's and having your research question be addressing something related to that topic. And for relevance, yeah, a lot has been written about death, but as a society, we keep changing, and aspects about who we are and what we do as individuals and groups keep changing too. And what may be applicable to one context may not work for another. So going back to that formulating the research question, again, we return to that matter of how do you make something specific enough and narrow enough to answer, while also taking that, what would make these results potentially be important, and how that might change ideas and practice. And that doesn't need to mean changing the whole world around. That could just be changing it in your very local context, in your church, in your religious group, in your family, perhaps. One of the great things, if you pick something like death, is that communities have so many different elements and sometimes their own traditions about it. I sing at a Catholic church right now in Hawaii, and they had one of their deacons pass away. And so they have mentioned their name several times in services and in the bulletin and things like that. And other churches will have their own ways of doing it. Some might put up a picture on the projector, some might have a special service or two. There might be a tradition of celebrating the life afterwards. And all these say that little context, those things matter to the people involved. And so you might be picking a question that other people have answered in a different context, but you're answering it for your context, your now, your community, and it's important to the people that in that community. So probably the greatest challenge that people have when they're writing their first research question is wanting it to be too large in scope, to be saying, well, I've seen these other things writing about it. I want to write something like that. And then forget that, oh, hey, you only have so many weeks to work on this final project. So make sure it's something that you can answer, that you can delve into. And then if in doubt, you can always talk to your professor or come to the writing center and say, hey, do my questions look like they're of appropriate scope? So with that, I think we're going to bring it to a close. If you'd like to work with the Writing Center, you can always send us an email with a quick question. But if it's something that you like detailed feedback on your paper, go ahead and head off to my.acu.edu under the groups page, select the Online Writing Center and follow the instructions for making an appointment. You can make an email appointment where you sign up for time, upload a copy of your paper, and then by the time the appointment arrives, send us that copy for us to look at. You have Until the appointment starts to do that. If you're running late, send us a quick email, then send us the paper. And you can also sign up for a Zoom appointment where you're meeting with someone in real time and you can ask questions back and forth. So with that, thank you for joining us. And again, if you have a quick question, feel free to send us an email and we'll catch you later.